There's a particular kind of silence Jung documented that most people misunderstand. The silence that emerges not from withholding or punishment, but from the completion of differentiation. When you've done the shadow work necessary to withdraw from participation mystique, you stop explaining, not strategically, not to punish, but because the compulsion to explain, to justify, to defend, to make others understand your reality, simply dissolves. You exist in your reality. They exist in theirs. And the gap between these realities is no longer your problem to close through constant verbal negotiation. This silence, this genuine psychological silence that comes from sovereignty rather than strategy, reveals something in others that they've spent their entire lives avoiding. Their dependence. Not dependence on you specifically, but dependence on external validation to maintain their internal reality. Dependence on others participating in their projections. Dependence on constant explanation and justification from those around them to confirm that their version of events, their emotional reactions, their interpretations are correct. When you stop providing this, when you become silent, their entire psychological structure destabilizes, and they experience your silence not as neutrality, but as the ultimate provocation. Jung observed a critical distinction that most people miss. There's a profound difference between silence as a weapon and silence as a natural state. Silence used strategically, what contemporary psychology calls stonewalling, is a form of emotional manipulation. It's refusing to engage specifically to punish, to create anxiety, to maintain control. This silence is active withholding. It's participation in the dynamic through absence rather than presence. But the silence Jung documented in differentiated individuals is completely different. It's not strategic. It's not designed to hurt. It's not calculated to create a particular response. It's simply what emerges when you've withdrawn from dynamics that require constant verbal participation to maintain. You're not refusing to explain to punish them. You've recognized that explanation itself is participation in participation mystique, and you're no longer available for that fusion. This distinction matters enormously, because when someone accuses you of the silent treatment, they're often correct that silence is happening, but they're projecting motive. They're interpreting your silence through the lens of their own experience with strategic silence. Silence as weapon, as punishment, as control. They cannot conceive of silence that simply exists because you've differentiated, because you've completed the psychological work that makes constant explanation unnecessary. Let's be specific about what explanation actually is in undifferentiated relationships. Jung documented that in participation mystique, the unconscious fusion that characterizes most relationships, people are constantly negotiating reality through language. When something happens, both parties immediately begin explaining their experience, their feelings, their interpretation, trying to align their internal realities through verbal exchange. This is what I felt. This is what I meant. This is how I experienced that. You need to understand why I did this. This constant explanation feels like communication. It feels like intimacy, like working things out, like being there for each other. But Jung observed it's actually the mechanism through which fusion is maintained. You're not explaining to share your reality. You're explaining to get the other person to validate your reality. To confirm that your feelings are justified, your interpretation is correct, your experience is the real one. And they're doing the same thing. Both of you are using explanation as a way to regulate each other's perception of events. This creates a dynamic where neither person can simply exist in their own experience without immediately translating it into language for the other's consumption and approval. You can't just feel what you feel. You have to explain what you feel so they understand it, validate it, adjust their reality to accommodate it. And when they don't, when your explanation doesn't produce the validation you need, you explain more. You clarify. You give more context. You try different words. You escalate the explanation hoping that eventually, if you just say it right, they'll finally understand and confirm your reality. Jung documented this as one of the primary mechanisms of participation mystique, the compulsive need for external validation of internal experience. And explanation is the tool through which that validation is sought. When you differentiate, when you do the shadow work that creates genuine psychological sovereignty, this compulsion dissolves, not because you've decided to stop explaining, but because you no longer need others to validate your reality in order to know it's real. You know what you experienced, you know what you feel, you know what's true for you, and that knowing exists independently of whether anyone else understands it, agrees with it, or validates it. Your reality is yours. It doesn't require external confirmation. And when reality doesn't require external confirmation, explanation becomes optional. Sometimes you might choose to share your experience, but you're not compelled to. You're not driven by need. You're simply existing in your own reality, and whether others understand it is genuinely no longer your concern. This is the silence that reveals their dependence. Because when you stop explaining, they're suddenly confronted with something they've been avoiding. They need your explanation. They need your constant verbal negotiation of reality. They need you to keep translating your internal experience into language they can use to regulate their internal experience. Without your explanation, they're left alone with their interpretation. And that interpretation, without your constant input to shape it, reveals itself as projection. Let me be clear about what happens psychologically when you become silent after years of explaining. In the old dynamic, when something happened that created tension or misunderstanding, you would immediately begin the explanation process. This is what I meant. This is why I did that. Let me clarify. And they would do the same. And together, through this verbal exchange, you would negotiate a shared reality that both of you could inhabit. The explanation wasn't just sharing information, it was the mechanism through which fusion was maintained. But now you're differentiated. So when something happens, you simply exist in your experience of it. You don't immediately translate it into explanation. You don't rush to clarify, to justify, to make them understand. You know what's true for you, and you rest in that knowing, silently, not strategically, not to punish, but because the compulsion to explain simply isn't there anymore. And they feel this immediately. They feel the absence of your explanation, and they experience it not as you resting in your own reality, but as you withholding from them. Why won't you talk to me? Why are you being silent? You're giving me the silent treatment. And there's truth in their observation. You are being silent. But the interpretation is projection. Your silence isn't treatment. It's not strategy. It's not punishment. It's simply the natural state that emerges when you're no longer compelled to constantly explain yourself. But to someone operating from participation mystique, silence without explanation is incomprehensible. Because in their framework, silence means something. It means anger, or punishment, or withdrawal, or passive aggression. They cannot conceive of silence that simply exists because you're centered in your own reality and don't need to constantly translate it for external consumption. So they project motive onto your silence, and then they react to the projection. Jung observed that this projection of motive onto silence is always revealing. What they accuse your silence of being, cold, punishing, manipulative, cruel, is actually what they would be doing if they were silent. They're projecting their own relationship with silence onto you. If they were silent, it would be strategic. It would be designed to hurt. So your silence must be the same. The possibility that your silence is simply genuine, that you're resting in your own reality without needing to explain it, doesn't register, because they've never experienced that kind of silence themselves. And here's where the dependence becomes visible. As long as you were explaining, they could regulate their interpretation of you through your words. When you said, "I'm not angry," they could adjust their perception. When you said, "This is what I meant," they could recalibrate their understanding. Your constant explanation was the external input they used to manage their internal reality about you. But now you're silent. Now there's no explanation to adjust to, no clarification to incorporate, no justification to process. They're left alone with their interpretation, and that interpretation, without your constant input to shape it, reveals itself as entirely their own projection. When you were explaining, they could believe their interpretation was based on your words. But now, with no words to base it on, it becomes obvious. They're making it up. They're projecting onto your silence whatever they fear, whatever they're avoiding, whatever their shadow contains. And this revelation is unbearable. Because as long as they could point to your words, "You said this, so I interpreted it as that," they could maintain the illusion that their understanding of you was based on you. But your silence removes that illusion. Now it's just them and their projection. And the projection, no longer anchored to your explanations, floats free. And in that floating, they have to confront something they've been avoiding. They don't actually know you. They know their projection of you. And without your constant explanation to give that projection substance, it's revealed as hollow. Jung documented this as one of the most powerful confrontations differentiation creates. When you stop explaining, projection loses its anchor, and people are forced to recognize that what they thought they knew about you was actually what they projected onto you. This recognition rarely happens consciously. More often it manifests as rage, as accusations, as demands that you explain yourself, talk to them, stop being silent, stop punishing them with your distance. But what they're really demanding is that you go back to providing the constant external input they were using to avoid their own psychological work. They want you to explain so they can go back to adjusting their interpretation based on your words, rather than confronting that their interpretation is projection. Your silence forces them to sit with their own mind. And their own mind without external regulation is chaotic, full of projection, assumption, fear, unintegrated shadow material. And they experience this chaos as your fault, as something your silence is creating rather than something your silence is revealing. Let's explore what your silence specifically reveals about their dependence. Jung observed that people who've organized their identity around being understood have an intense need for others to constantly explain themselves, not because they're genuinely curious about others' internal experience, but because they need constant external input to regulate their own anxiety about being misunderstood themselves. When you explain yourself constantly, it models for them that explanation is required, that reality needs to be verbally negotiated, that understanding is something achieved through constant communication. This modeling serves a function. It confirms that their compulsive need to explain themselves is normal, healthy, necessary. But when you stop explaining, when you become silent, you withdraw that confirmation. And suddenly their constant need to explain themselves is revealed as what it actually is: dependence on external validation. They're not explaining themselves to share. They're explaining themselves to get confirmation that their reality is the correct one. And as long as you were also explaining constantly, this dependence was hidden in mutual participation. But your silence reveals it, because now you're modeling something different, that you can exist in your reality without needing to constantly translate it into language for others' approval, that you can know what's true for you without requiring external confirmation, that your experience is valid simply because you experienced it, not because someone else understood and validated it. And this modeling threatens their entire framework. Because if you can exist without constant explanation, what does that say about their need for constant explanation? If you can be silent and grounded in your own knowing, What does that reveal about their compulsive need to be understood? Your silence becomes a mirror reflecting their dependence. And rather than look at that reflection, rather than recognize their own compulsive explanation seeking as dependence on external validation, they project onto your silence. They make your silence the problem. They accuse you of being cold, distant, withholding, punishing. And here's what Jung observed that most people miss. These accusations are always confessions. When they accuse your silence of being cold, they're revealing that they experience anyone not constantly explaining themselves to them as cold. When they accuse your silence of being punishing, they're revealing that they experience the absence of explanation as punishment. When they accuse your silence of being manipulative, they're revealing that they would only be silent to manipulate. The accusations tell you nothing about your silence. They tell you everything about their relationship with silence. And more specifically, they reveal their dependence on constant external verbal input to manage their internal chaos. Without your explanation, they don't know what to do with their own interpretation. They don't know how to sit with uncertainty, with not knowing, with the gap between their perception and your reality. They need you to close that gap through explanation, and when you don't, they experience it as abandonment. Jung documented that this experience of silence as abandonment is actually the experience of being left alone with your own mind, without external regulation. For people who've never developed the capacity to self-regulate, who've never done the shadow work necessary to sit with their own projections and recognize them as projections, being left alone with their interpretation is terrifying. Because their interpretation, without external input to shape it, goes to the worst possible places. To fear, to catastrophe, to rejection, to all the shadow material they've been projecting onto others their entire lives. Your silence doesn't create this chaos. Your silence reveals it. Because as long as you were explaining, they could use your words to regulate their internal experience. But now, without your words, they're confronted with what's actually there when external regulation is removed. Unintegrated shadow material, chronic projection, dependence on others to maintain their reality. And this confrontation is experienced not as an opportunity for growth, but as an attack, as you being cruel, cold, withholding, punishing. Let me be specific about what silence does that explanation prevented. When you explain, you're giving the other person material to work with, words to parse, meanings to interpret, intentions to evaluate. This gives their mind something to do, something external to focus on. And as long as they're focused on your words, they're not focused on their own projections. Explanation serves as a distraction from their internal chaos. But when you're silent, there's nothing external to focus on. No words to parse. No meanings to interpret, no explanations to evaluate. They're left alone with whatever their mind generates about your silence. And what their mind generates, in the absence of external input, is entirely projection. Every meaning they assign to your silence, every motive they attribute to it, every interpretation they make of it, all projection, pure undiluted projection with no external anchor. And Jung observed that most people cannot tolerate prolonged contact with their own undiluted projection. Because projection, when it's not anchored to someone else's actual words or behaviors, is obviously projection. It becomes impossible to maintain the illusion that I'm interpreting what they said when they said nothing. Now it's just I'm making up what they mean by saying nothing. And that recognition that what's happening is entirely internal, entirely their own creation, is what silence forces. This is why silence is so much more confronting than any words could be. Words give them something to argue with, something to misinterpret, something to use as evidence for their projection. But silence gives them nothing. And in that nothing, they're forced to confront that everything they're experiencing is coming from inside them. Your silence isn't doing anything to them. Your silence is simply revealing what they do to themselves in the absence of external regulation. Jung documented that people who've developed genuine psychological sovereignty, who've done the shadow work necessary to recognize and integrate their own projections, can sit comfortably with others' silence, because they don't need constant external input to know their own reality. They can tolerate not knowing what someone else is thinking or feeling without immediately filling that gap with projection. They can exist in uncertainty without experiencing it as threat. But people who haven't done this work, who are still dependent on external validation to maintain their internal reality, cannot tolerate silence, because silence is uncertainty, and uncertainty, for someone who hasn't developed the capacity to self-regulate, is destabilizing. They need to know. They need to understand. They need explanation. Not because explanation actually helps them understand you, but because the process of receiving and evaluating explanation gives them something to do with their anxiety about not knowing. This is the dependence your silence reveals. And once you see this dependence clearly, once you recognize that their demand for explanation is actually their dependence on external input to manage internal chaos, you stop experiencing their accusations as meaningful. You recognize them as projection, as their confrontation with their own inability to self-regulate, and you remain silent. Not to punish, not to prove a point, but because you genuinely have nothing to explain. You know your reality. You're grounded in your experience. You're clear about your intentions. And none of that requires external validation. So there's nothing to explain. Not because you're withholding explanation, but because explanation isn't necessary when you're not seeking validation. You're simply existing in your reality. And whether they understand it, approve of it, or validate it is genuinely irrelevant to you. This irrelevance, this genuine lack of need for their understanding, is what they ultimately cannot bear. Because it means they cannot regulate you through their interpretation. They cannot control your reality through their demands for explanation. They cannot pull you back into participation mystique through accusations about your silence. You're simply unavailable. Not strategically. Structurally. Your entire psychological system has reorganized in a way that makes dependence on external validation obsolete. And when they realize this, when it becomes clear that no amount of demanding, accusing, or escalating will make you explain yourself, they have to choose. They can either do their own shadow work to develop the capacity to self-regulate without constant external input, or they can find someone else who's still available for the constant explanation-seeking that maintains participation mystique. What they can no longer do is use your explanation to avoid their own psychological work. Jung observed that this choice point is when projection either transforms or transfers. Some people, when they've exhausted all attempts to get you to explain, begin to wonder, why do I need their explanation so badly? What am I avoiding in myself that requires constant external input to manage? What would it mean to sit with not knowing and recognize that my interpretation of their silence is entirely my own projection? These questions mark the beginning of shadow work, the beginning of recognizing dependence and choosing integration instead. But more commonly, Jung documented, people who cannot get you to explain simply transfer their projection to someone else. They find new people who are still willing to constantly explain themselves, who are still operating from the need for external validation, who are still available for participation mystique. And they repeat the entire pattern. The silence that revealed their dependence becomes something they avoid rather than something they learn from. And you, the one whose silence triggered the whole confrontation, are left with a choice. You can feel guilty for not explaining. You can question whether your silence is actually cold or punishing. You can wonder if maybe you should just explain to keep the peace. Or you can recognize that your silence is simply your natural state after differentiation, and their response to it reveals their work, not yours. Jung observed that this is the test of whether your silence is genuine or strategic. If you can remain silent without defending your silence, without explaining why you're silent, without justifying your lack of explanation, then it's genuine. It's structural. It's simply who you are after completing enough psychological work that constant explanation is no longer compulsive. But if you find yourself defending your silence, explaining why you won't explain, justifying your lack of justification, then you're still caught in the dynamic. You're still participating in participation mystique, just through meta-explanation instead of direct explanation. Genuine silence doesn't defend itself. It doesn't explain itself. It simply exists. And it remains silent about its silence. This is perhaps the deepest level of sovereignty Jung documented. Not just the capacity to be silent about your experience, but the capacity to be silent about your silence. To let them interpret it however they need to interpret it. To allow them to project whatever they need to project. To remain grounded in your knowing that your silence is simply your genuine state, regardless of how they experience it. Because here's what Jung understood that most people miss. You cannot control how others experience you. You cannot make them see that your silence isn't cold. You cannot force them to recognize that you're not punishing them. You cannot explain your way out of their projection. All you can do is exist in your reality. And if your reality is silent, then you exist in silence. Not to make a point. Not to teach them something. Not to force them to do their work. But simply because silence is your genuine state after you've done the work, they're still avoiding. Your silence reveals their dependence. But that revelation is their opportunity, not your responsibility. You're not silent to reveal anything. You're silent because you've completed enough differentiation that constant explanation is no longer necessary. The revelation that occurs, that they're dependent on external validation, that they cannot self-regulate without constant input, that they project chaos onto silence, is their confrontation with their own psychology. And what they do with that confrontation is entirely up to them. Jung spent his life documenting that the goal of individuation isn't to make everyone understand you. It's not to explain yourself so thoroughly that projection becomes impossible. It's to become whole, to integrate shadow, to develop genuine sovereignty, to exist in your own reality regardless of others' interpretations. And sometimes, often that means being silent while others rage at your silence, project onto your silence, demand explanation for your silence. Your silence isn't cruelty. It's not coldness. It's not punishment. It's consciousness. It's the natural state that emerges when you've done the work of making the unconscious conscious and no longer need external validation to know your own reality. And their rage at your silence isn't about you. It's about what your silence reveals in them. Dependence they're avoiding, projection they're not integrating, shadow work they're still refusing. You cannot make them see this. You cannot explain it in a way that makes them understand. Because understanding requires the same psychological work you've done, and they have to choose that work for themselves. All you can do is remain in your reality, silent, grounded, clear, and trust that your silence, though it reveals their dependence, is exactly what genuine psychological maturity looks like. This is why your silence reveals their dependence, and this is why your silence is not your problem to explain, defend, or sacrifice. It's simply who you've become, and who you've become is someone who exists in their own reality without needing constant external validation to know it's real. That's not coldness. That's sovereignty. And sovereignty, Jung observed, is always misinterpreted by those who haven't developed it. Remain silent, not to prove anything, not to make them do their work, but simply because silence is your genuine state after you've done the work of becoming whole. And that wholeness doesn't require explanation. It simply is. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to breathe, and remember that awareness grows when it's shared. Subscribe, so you don't lose your way when the next reflection arrives. Leave a like, It helps this message reach others who need to hear it but don't yet know why. And share your thoughts below, because every comment here becomes a spark, one awakened mind helping another remember. Together we move beyond the dark.